My name is Max Lugavere. I'm a health and science journalist and the author of Genius Foods: Become Smarter, Happier, and More Productive While Protecting Your Brain for Life. It's an owner's manual for your brain to make your brain work better so that you feel better, you have more energy, you feel happier, while also minimizing your risk for some of America's most feared diseases, like Alzheimer's disease. So a couple of years ago, it was at that exact time that my mom began showing signs of memory loss. And I didn't know it at the time, but those were the earliest symptoms of what inevitably became a mysterious form of dementia. You know, after going around the country with her to various neurology departments, I became basically unable to focus on anything but research and understanding to the best of my ability how diet and lifestyle may have contributed to what I was seeing develop in my mom. So I moved from Los Angeles, where I was living at the time, back to New York. I just became really interested in digging into PubMed and learning everything I could about dementia, the etiology of dementia, you know, what will cause a person to become demented, all the various forms of dementia, as well as other neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's disease. And I became really interested in what at the time was a fairly novel idea that nobody was talking about: dementia prevention. Certain forms of dementia, like Alzheimer's disease, which is the most common form of it, begins in the brain decades before the first symptom of memory loss. 30 to 40 years by some calculations, and some evidence suggests even earlier than that. And I realized that all this time I had been thinking of dementia as an old person's disease, and I realized that I was completely wrong, that dementia begins in the brain far earlier than the emergence of symptoms. And suddenly I became really interested in what I could do to protect my own brain. Nobody was talking about it at the time. And I wanted to, you know, on the one hand, learn as much as I possibly could, and on the other hand, spread this information, because I felt like it was something that people really needed to be talking about. I decided to do a documentary called Breadhead, which would, on the one hand, allow me to create a work that would speak to my generation about this topic. And on the other hand, it would give me the sort of ability to call up some of the top researchers in the world. So, I mean, I reached out to researchers at Harvard, Brown, Cornell. I went overseas and I've, you know, visited labs in Berlin, Germany, and Stockholm, Sweden, in Helsinki, Finland. Breadhead really is, it's a feature-length documentary to sort of wrap all these insights together and present as a work this really compelling case that our cognitive destiny is within our control for the vast majority of dementia cases. Over the course of that journey, I learned a lot about the brain and nutrition, and about lifestyle factors like light exposure, sleep, exercise. And as focused as I was for so long on Alzheimer's and dementia prevention, inevitably I learned a lot about what makes the brain work best. You know, whether we're talking about depression, which many people consider to be a moral failing, or an inability to focus, the same. You know, so many people find that, you know, when they're stuck behind their desks for 9 hours a day, their inability to focus on their work is somehow reflective of a problem with their brains. I realized that so much of the ways in which our brains function and operate on a moment-to-moment basis is dictated by our diets and by our lifestyles. And so that really gave birth to Genius Foods, which is, you know, my book that is really an all-in-one comprehensive deep dive into everything that you need to do to make your brain work at its best. Nutrition, what we eat, how we live our lives, this is something that I think we should all become experts in, without question. Doctors are not authorities on nutrition. This is a fact. Most of the doctors that I've spoken to get a couple of hours over one afternoon in regards to nutrition training, and that nutrition training that they get is usually outdated and, you know, not fully evidence-based. And the same goes for nutritionists. And so while I have utmost respect for people that decide to go into that as a career path, the dietary guidelines that we are seemingly force-fed, no pun intended, in this country are not evidence-based. I mean, today we're still advised to, you know, include whole grains, for example, at every meal. That's what the USDA My Plate dietary paradigm implores us to do, to include grains at every meal. That's not an evidence-based recommendation. The latest research, a meta-analysis performed by Cochrane, which is an organization known for their unbiased, systematic reviews of health literature in partnership with the World Health Organization, found that there's no good evidence when looking at randomized controlled trials, which are the kinds of trials required to prove cause and effect, that whole grains improve health. So why are we eating them? As filler? As if we're like, feedlot cows? No. What I want to eat, I want, my diet to be dictated by the kind of diet I might have consumed or my ancestors might have consumed during which our brains evolved. For millions of years, the food supply on this planet was a certain way. And, the first iteration of the human species ate in a way that caused our brains to evolve. About 10,000 years ago, we turned our backs on that diet, and over time, our brains actually lost the volumetric equivalent of a tennis ball. And that shift was called the agricultural revolution, which ultimately paved the way for the fact that today, 60% of the calories that we consume worldwide come from 3 plants. There are 50,000 edible plant species on Earth. Today, we consume most of our calories wheat, corn, and rice. These plants are great for growing a population, supplying cheap energy, but they're very nutrient poor, and there's nothing in them that our brains require, ultimately. There's no, human biological requirement for grains, for corn, for rice, for wheat. The awareness around Alzheimer's disease is really fueled by a few organizations that fund research, and their ability to raise funds is in a large part fueled by the fear surrounding the disease. As long as we feel helpless and hopeless and that there's no cure in sight, we're going to continue to put money into these organizations that fund research towards a pharmaceutical cure. And that research really over the past couple of decades has been dictated by one governing hypothesis as to why Alzheimer's disease develops in the brain. It's called the amyloid hypothesis, that there's this plaque in the brain that ultimately causes Alzheimer's disease, and if we're able to remove that plaque from the brain, we'll be able to cure the disease. Unfortunately, Alzheimer's drug trials have a 99.6% fail rate. In looking at the research in terms of prevention and all that stuff, although I never felt like that was at odds with the quest for a cure, and in fact, I support fully the quest for a cure. If there was a pharmaceutical pill that would emerge that I could give my mom tomorrow to cure what she has, I would do it in a second. Well, I would say the biggest myth surrounding Alzheimer's disease and brain health in general is that we can't do anything to affect our odds or to change our brain health. AARP did a study in 2015 that found that more than 90% of Americans believe that brain health is really important, yet largely are in the dark in terms of how to maintain or improve it. So most people don't really know how to improve brain health and don't really understand that Alzheimer's disease is something that we can potentially prevent. I think probably the most impactful thing that one can do is practice a variety of different types of exercise. Aerobic exercise doesn't have to be done in the gym. I try to imbue my day with as much movement as I can, whether it's taking the stairs when given the opportunity, riding a bicycle whenever I can, or just, picking up the pace as I'm walking through the city. Movement is really good in terms of increasing blood flow to the brain, releasing protective growth factors in the brain, like something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is sort of called by some to be the miracle grow for the brain. It helps fortify your brain with new brain cells. And in general, what's good for the body is good for the brain. Just moving helps to mobilize fluids throughout the body that don't have their own heart. And a perfect example of that is the body's lymphatic system, and it was recently found that the body's lymphatic system is directly connected to the brain. And this is sort of the body's waste disposal system of ducts, and it's connected to the brain. So in terms of minimizing exposure to waste products, flushing them through the body, movement is vital. Anaerobic exercise, so high intensity, weight training, so important for men and for women. High intensity interval training, really important. It was recently found that in young, healthy people who are already thought to be at their peak cognitive prowess, high intensity interval training was enough to not only boost cognitive function, but increase the expression of BDNF. So, you know, previously aerobic exercise was really sort of hailed as being the chief way of increasing this protein in the brain. But now we know that, you know, weightlifting, high intensity interval training is a really efficient way of doing the same thing. Building muscle strength from a hormonal standpoint is one of the best things that you could do to maintain your body's sensitivity to insulin. It also is sort of like increasing your credit limit in terms of giving you more leeway to consume foods that are higher in carbohydrate. Typically, you know, when we consume foods that are high in carbs, those carbs are either going to be burnt off in the moment or they're going to be stored, either in your muscle or your fat tissue. You know, your muscle tissue has a finite storage capacity for glucose, whereas you can store virtually an unlimited amount of fat. So if we're consuming a lot of carbs and we're not active and we don't have, you know, relatively large muscle, or, you know, at least enough for our body size, I mean, that extra glucose is going to get turned into fat. Dietarily, I think, you know, one of the biggest things for me, just in terms of how I eat, has been liberating myself from the notion that we have to eat every 3 to 4 hours per day. I became interested in fitness and in health at a time when the guiding philosophy was that to stoke the metabolic flame, you had to sort of eat, you know, every 3 hours. Protein, carbs, fat. Metabolic chamber studies, which is when people basically get told to live in a room that measures their calorie expenditure, has found that whether we're eating, you know, 3 to 4 meals throughout the day, or we concentrate those meals into 2 or 3, or even 1, you know, there's very little metabolic difference, if any. That's been very liberating, and it also reduces decision fatigue. You know, if we're trying to eat really healthily 6 times a day, that becomes really hard, you know, whereas if we get to basically decide our meals twice a day or 3 times a day, you know, it reduces that fatigue. It makes shopping a lot easier. And I think for people living in the real world, I mean, that's a non-trivial benefit of eating fewer meals. The same diet that's going to put you at increased risk for depression and make you more depressed and more anxious. This is not just about correlation. This is about actual research showing that, you know, eating a crappy diet actually affects the way that you think. That's also the same diet that seems to accelerate brain aging and accelerate plaque deposition, the same plaque that's related to Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. It's one human diet. It's not, you know, a diet for the heart, you know, that's different from a diet for the brain. There are certain nutrients that are, you know, studied to be very powerful in regard to brain function, and we highlight those in the book. But in terms of like the whole foods that promote a healthy brain, an optimal brain, those foods are also going to make your heart kick more ass day to day. They're also the foods that are going to, you know, reduce indigestion and, you know, make sure that the microbiota, the 30 million trillion rather microbes that live in your large intestine, are kept happy. When it comes to Alzheimer's prevention, it's not about just one food. There's not a single food that's going to prevent Alzheimer's disease for you, but it's about the diet. It's about, you know, what you're eating day to day, how you're living day to day. But in terms of specific foods that are powerful brain boosters, I mean, let's take avocados. I think it's funny that avocados are shaped like a bomb, if you think about it, because I consider avocados as being the perfect food to drop a bomb on inflammation and oxidative stress. They're also packed with really important carotenoids, which are pigments. In the case of avocado, it's lutein and zeaxanthin, which have been shown to actually boost processing speed in the brain and make your brain cells work more efficiently. But the problem is those carotenoids need fat to be properly absorbed. Well, in an avocado is loaded with healthy fat in the form of monounsaturated fat, oleic acid. It's rich in dietary fiber. It's packed with potassium. You know, researchers speculate that our hunter-gatherer ancestors ate 4 times the potassium over the course of the day that we eat today, because potassium is rich in fruits and vegetables and things like that. Well, an avocado has twice the potassium of a banana. So it's just an incredible all-in-one health food. My recommendation in Genius Foods is to eat half to a whole avocado every single day. An avocado is not going to help you prevent Alzheimer's disease. If you're eating a whole avocado every day on top of a crappy diet, it's not going to move the needle for you in terms of Alzheimer's prevention. You know, I also want to be very careful in terms of misleading people. You could still do everything right according to the book and still develop Alzheimer's disease. We don't know everything about the disease. And you know, there could still be a to be discovered genetic risk factor that has a determinant effect. The most well-defined Alzheimer's risk gene that we know about is the ApoE4 allele, and 97% of people that develop Alzheimer's disease develop it because of the interplay between that risk gene and the choices that they make in their lives. But there could be a to be determined gene that circumvents all of our best efforts. By doing everything right, we're helping stack the odds in our favor. Okay, it's not a get out of jail free card. There is still genes which weigh in on, our health outcomes to some degree, but for the most part, genes are not destiny. In terms of that insurance that we can sort of buy today, as we await greater clarity in terms of research and nutrigenomics and pharmacogenomics, these are absolutely meaningful changes and foods that have a meaningful impact on your mental health, your brain health, and your risk for Alzheimer's disease. I think removing the processed junk foods from your diet is probably the most important step. And you could do that in tandem with adding in the genius foods. The notion of eating everything in moderation that's terrible advice to give somebody, because we live in a world where we are faced with foods and food choices every day that are literally not designed to be consumed in moderation. They're designed to be overconsumed. The way to stop consuming them is really to try to wean yourself off of them, and it might be difficult for the first 2 weeks as you go into withdrawal. A lot of these foods promote withdrawal because they light up our brain's reward centers in a way that no whole food can do by itself. It's really important to get yourself off of that drip, because at a certain point you'll cross a line where you don't even crave them anymore. Try to have just a handful. You can't. I mean, that notion of once you pop, you can't stop, that's a truism with scientific backing. There are people that make a lot more money than me sitting in labs that are literally working 9 to 10 to 12 hours a day trying to figure out the best combination of ingredients that are going to hook you to their product, that are going to make that bag of chips that you eat or that pint of ice cream something that just disappears before your very eyes. Diversity, in terms of the hunter-gatherer diet, probably a very good thing. Dietary diversity in the modern supermarket, not a very good thing.